There was once a boy who belonged to two countries, and in a strange way, to neither of them. His name was Alem. He was young enough to still believe that adults knew what they were doing, old enough to understand that sometimes they did not. And he was innocent enough to believe that if a person was good and honest and kind, then the world would be kind in return. He would learn that this was not always true, but he would learn something else too, that even when the world was frightening, there could still be people who opened their doors. There could still be strangers who offered a hand. There could still be friendship. There could still be kindness. And sometimes, when everything familiar had disappeared, a person could begin to build a new home from the smallest things: a room, a warm meal, a school bag, a quiet conversation, a friend, a name remembered by someone else. And so, on a night when the world outside was dark and still, a boy began a journey that would change the rest of his life. He did not know where the journey would take him, he did not know how long it would last, and most of all, he did not know whether he would ever truly feel at home again. Alem had grown up hearing stories about places that were far away. His parents came from different backgrounds, and the history of their countries was complicated. There were borders that had changed, there were wars that had begun and ended, there were governments that had risen and fallen, there were people who had been forced to leave their homes, and there were families who had spent years wondering whether they would ever return. For Alem, these things belonged to the adult world. They were conversations that stopped when children entered the room. They were the names of countries spoken carefully. They were stories that seemed to live inside newspapers and television screens, rather than in ordinary life. But the older he became, the more he understood that history was not something that only happened in books. History could arrive at your front door. It could take your home. It could separate families. It could change the meaning of the word tomorrow. Alem's father understood this better than anyone. He knew that life around their family was growing dangerous. He knew that his son's safety could no longer be taken for granted, and so, one day, a decision was made. Alem would travel to Britain. At first, the idea felt almost like an adventure. Britain, London, a distant place that Alem knew mostly through imagination. He had heard about the rain. He had heard about the cold. He had heard about the enormous city filled with people from every corner of the world. Perhaps, he thought, London would be exciting. Perhaps there would be tall buildings. Perhaps there would be football. Perhaps there would be streets full of voices speaking languages he had never heard. Perhaps he would make friends. Perhaps he would come home again soon. He did not yet understand that he was not simply going on a journey. He was leaving one life behind, and he had no idea what life would take its place. When Alem arrived in London, the city seemed enormous. It was louder than he had expected. Buses rolled through crowded streets. Cars hurried past. People walked quickly, often without looking at one another. There were shops and signs and lights everywhere. Different languages floated through the air. For a moment, Alem felt something close to excitement. This was a new world. Perhaps a new beginning. But the feeling did not last, because Alem soon discovered that the person who had brought him to Britain was not going to stay beside him. His father had left him in London, not because he did not love him, but because he believed London was safer. Sometimes, love makes decisions that children cannot understand, and Alem was left to face a terrible question. What happens to a child when the people who are supposed to protect him are no longer there? He waited. He hoped. He tried to understand. But the answers did not come. Instead, Alem found himself in a world of adults who ask questions. Where are your parents? Where do you live? What happened? Where are you from? What is your name? How old are you? Each question seemed simple, but none of the answers felt simple. Alem was a boy. But suddenly, he was also a case, a file, a person whose future depended on paperwork and interviews and decisions made in distant rooms. He had become part of a system he did not understand. People spoke about immigration. They spoke about asylum, about countries and borders and evidence, about whether someone had a right to remain. Alem listened, and somewhere inside himself he wondered how a person's whole life could fit inside the boxes on a form. He wanted to say, I am just a boy. I am frightened. I miss my family. I want to go home. But the word home had already become complicated. Eventually Alem was placed with a foster family. For the first time in a long while, he had somewhere to sleep. There was a bed, there was food, there was warmth. There were people who were willing to care for him. These things mattered. more than he could explain, but safety did not feel like home, not at first. At night, when the house grew quiet, Alem thought about his parents. He thought about the places he had known before, the sounds of his childhood, the taste of familiar food, the comfort of his own language, the feeling of waking up and knowing exactly where he was. In London, he sometimes woke and needed a moment to remember. Then the truth returned. He was far away. He was alone, and he did not know what would happen next. The foster family tried to help him. They were not perfect. No family is. But there were moments of kindness, a meal placed gently in front of him, a question asked with real concern, a warm coat given because the weather was colder than anything he had ever known. Small things, ordinary things. Yet when someone has lost almost everything familiar, ordinary kindness becomes extraordinary. And slowly Alem began to understand that life in Britain would not be one single feeling. There would be frightening days, there would be confusing days, but there might also be good days. And sometimes, the good days would arrive without warning. School was another world. Alem had to learn how to be among other young people again. He had to learn the rhythms of British life, the jokes, the slang, the lessons, the rules, the strange little habits that everyone else seemed to know by heart. At first, it felt as though everyone had been given a secret instruction manual. Everyone, except him. So he watched. He listened. He tried to understand. Sometimes he misunderstood. Sometimes people misunderstood him. And sometimes, when he struggled to explain himself, he felt a quiet frustration rise inside him. Not because anyone had done anything wrong, but because it was tiring, always having to explain who you were. Alem did not want to tell his whole life story every time someone became curious. He wanted to be a normal boy. He wanted to talk about ordinary things. He wanted to laugh. He wanted to play. He wanted friends. And slowly, those things began to happen. He met people who saw past the word refugee. They saw Alem, a boy who could laugh, a boy who could get annoyed, a boy who had opinions, a boy who liked some things and disliked others, a boy who could be funny, a boy who could be stubborn, a boy who could be brave. Friendship gave Alem something that no official system could. It gave him a sense of belonging. Because a person does not feel at home because of a passport. Sometimes home begins when someone saves you a seat, when someone asks if you're coming out after school, when someone remembers your name, when someone listens to your story and does not look away. But even as Alem built a life in London, the past stayed close. He could not simply forget. He could not wake one morning and decide that everything before no longer mattered. His family was still somewhere in the world. His future was still uncertain, and every letter, every phone call, every conversation carried enormous weight. The adults around him tried to help. But Alem sometimes felt that nobody truly understood what it was like to be him, to be young, to be far from your parents, to live in a country that was not yet yours, to hear people discuss your future, as though you were not sitting in the room. There were moments when he wanted to shout, moments when he wanted to run, moments when he longed for the life he had known, even though he understood that the life he remembered might no longer exist. This is one of the strangest things about losing a home. You can miss a place even when you cannot safely return to it. You can love a country that has become dangerous. You can remember happiness alongside fear. You can carry two feelings at once. You can be grateful to be safe and still be deeply sad. Alem began to understand that these feelings did not cancel each other out. They could live together, side by side. The days passed, then the weeks, then the months, and London began to feel less strange. Alem learned the routes. He began to understand the buses. He learned which streets led where. He grew familiar with the sound of rain against the windows. He learned that British weather could change without warning, and he learned that people loved to complain about the weather, even when the weather was perfectly ordinary. He discovered that London held countless different kinds of people. People who had arrived from all over the world, people who spoke different languages, people with different beliefs, different histories, different ideas about what home meant. And perhaps this was one of the first things that made the city feel gentler. Alem realized he was not the only person carrying another country inside him. There were millions of people with stories. Some had moved for work, some for love, some because of war, some because they dreamed of a different future, some because they had no choice at all. London was a city of arrivals, and perhaps in some small way, Alem was becoming one of them. Yet the question of whether he could stay in Britain never fully disappeared. It followed him quietly, at school, at home, when he laughed with friends, when he ate dinner, when he drifted off to sleep. There was always the possibility that the life he was building could be taken away. That kind of uncertainty is heavy for a child to carry. Adults sometimes imagine that children do not notice these things, but children understand fear. They understand absence. They understand when adults lower their voices. They understand when something is wrong. Alem knew that his future rested on decisions made by people he had never met. He knew there were rules. He knew there were laws. But he wondered whether the people who wrote those rules truly understood the lives they touched. He was not a number. He was not an argument. He was not a political question. He was Alem, and he wanted to live. As his life in Britain continued, Alem began to change, not all at once, not dramatically, but quietly. He grew in confidence. He spoke more openly. He formed friendships. He discovered that people could surprise him. Some people were unkind. Some were afraid of things they did not understand. But others were generous. Others were brave. Others were willing to stand beside someone whose life was completely different from their own. Alem discovered that kindness could cross borders, more easily than people could. And perhaps that was one of the most important lessons of his journey. The world was not divided neatly into good countries and bad countries, good people and bad people, safe places and dangerous places. The world was more complicated than that. There were good people everywhere. There were people who were afraid, and there were people who were willing to help. Sometimes, when you are lost, you have to learn to recognize the people who are reaching out their hands. Alem's story was also a story about family. Because family is not always simple. Family can mean the people who gave you life, the people who raised you, the people who protect you, the people you have lost. And sometimes, family can mean the people you meet along the way, the people who help you survive, the people who remind you that you matter, the people who sit beside you when you are sad, the people who make you laugh when you thought you had forgotten how. Alem's family had been separated by things far beyond his control, but separation did not erase love. It did not erase memories. It did not erase longing, and it did not erase hope. There were nights when Alem pictured his parents. He imagined where they might be, what they might be doing, whether they were thinking of him. He imagined what it would be like to see them again. Would they see how much he had changed? Would they be proud? Would they ask him about London? Would he tell them everything? Or would there be too much to explain? These questions stayed with him. Sometimes he imagined returning. Sometimes he imagined staying. Sometimes he imagined a future where he did not have to choose, a future where he could belong to more than one place. Perhaps that was impossible, or perhaps it was not. Perhaps belonging was not a door that could only open in one direction. Perhaps a person could carry more than one home inside them. Perhaps Alem did not have to choose between the boy he had been and the person he was becoming. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being misunderstood. Alem knew that loneliness. People looked at him and saw a refugee, but he knew the word did not explain everything. It did not explain the games he had played, the people he loved, his memories, his hopes, the person he might one day become. Labels can be useful. They can help people understand complicated things, but labels can also become cages. Alem wanted to be seen as a whole person, not just as someone who had escaped, not just as someone who needed help, not just as someone whose future needed deciding. He wanted to be known. And slowly, through friendship and time and gentle days, he began to be known. This mattered. Perhaps more than he realized. The city itself became part of his story. London was no longer only the place where he had been left behind. It became the place where he learned, the place where he made friends, the place where he found kindness, new food, new words, new streets, new music, new ideas. The city was still noisy, still crowded, still confusing at times, but now it held memories, and memories can transform places. A street where you once felt lost can become the street where someone made you laugh. A school corridor can become the place where you met a friend. A small bedroom can become the first safe place you slept after losing everything. A city can slowly become familiar, not because it changes, but because you do. Alem's journey was never only about moving from one country to another. It was about becoming someone new. Every young person grows up, but some are asked to grow faster than others. Alem had to face questions that many adults spend their whole lives avoiding. Who am I? Where do I belong? What makes a home? What does it mean to be safe? What does it mean to be free? And how do you keep hope alive when the future is uncertain? There were no simple answers. Perhaps there never would be. But Alem began to understand that growing up did not mean answering every question. Sometimes growing up meant learning to live with uncertainty, learning to keep going, learning to accept help, learning to trust again, learning that being afraid does not mean being weak. And there were moments of happiness. This is important, because stories like Alem's are sometimes told only through sadness. But his life was not only sadness. There was laughter, there were jokes, there were ordinary school days, there were conversations that had nothing to do with war. There were moments when he forgot his worries, moments when he was simply a boy. And perhaps those moments were among the most precious, because happiness does not ask whether you deserve it. Sometimes it simply arrives. A friend says something ridiculous. The sun comes out. A meal tastes better than expected. A football rolls across a field. A song reminds you of something you love, and for a few minutes, the world becomes simple again. Alem learned to treasure those moments, not because they solved his problems, but because they reminded him that life was bigger than his problems. In time, Alem's understanding of Britain grew deeper too. He learned that the country was not one single thing. There were people who welcomed newcomers. There were people who feared them. There were people who did not think about them at all. And there were people who wanted more than anything to help. Alem noticed that people could argue about refugees without ever meeting one. They could talk about numbers, statistics, policies, borders. But behind every number was a person, a face, a name, a family, a story. Alem's life was one story, but it reminded him that there were many others. Children arriving alone, parents separated from the people they loved, people waiting for letters, people holding on to hope, people rebuilding their lives from whatever pieces remained. Alem began to see that his story was part of something much larger, but even so, his own story still mattered. It was his. He had not chosen the road that brought him to Britain. But he could choose what he did with the life that followed. That was not easy. Choice is hard when your options are few. But slowly, Alem understood that there were things nobody could take from him. His memories, his ability to learn, his capacity to love, his friendships, his dreams, his voice. These belonged to him, and perhaps one day, his future would too. There is a moment in many lives when a person realizes they have survived something. Sometimes it happens suddenly. Sometimes it happens years later. You look back and think, I was there. I lived through that. I did not know how I would get through it, but I did. For Alem, survival was not dramatic. It was waking up, going to school, eating breakfast, learning, making friends, sleeping, and waking again, day after day. Survival is often like that, quiet, ordinary, almost invisible, but every day you continue is a small victory. Every day you choose to hope is an act of courage. Alem would always carry the memory of the places he had left. He would always remember the people far away. He would always wonder about tomorrow. But he was no longer the same boy who had first arrived in London. The city had changed him. His friendships had changed him. His days had changed him. And most importantly, he had begun to understand that his identity was not something other people could decide for him. He was not only a refugee, not only an immigrant, not only a boy far from home, not only a child living in Britain. He was all of these things, and more. He was Alem. One evening, as the city settled into night, Alem thought about the idea of home. For a long time he had believed that home was a place, a house, a street, a country, a familiar landscape. But now he wondered if home could be something else. Perhaps home was the person who listened. Perhaps it was the friend who waited. Perhaps it was the family who opened their door. Perhaps it was the language you carried inside yourself, the memories that travelled with you. Perhaps home was not something you found. Perhaps it was something you built, slowly, carefully, piece by piece, like building a house from stones, one stone at a time, one day at a time, one friendship at a time. And so Alem continued. The road ahead was still uncertain. There would be more questions, more decisions, days when the past felt very close, but there would also be mornings. And mornings are important, because every morning carries the possibility that something might change, a letter might arrive, a friend might call, someone might say yes, a door might open. And even when none of those things happen, The sun still rises, the world continues, and you continue with it. Perhaps that is what hope really is, not the certainty that everything will be fine, but the quiet decision to keep moving forward without that certainty, to believe that tomorrow might hold something good, to believe that people can surprise you, to believe that kindness still exists, to believe that your story is not finished. Alem's story was not finished, not when he left his homeland, not when he arrived in London, not when he was parted from his family, not when he felt alone, not when he was afraid. Because a person's story is rarely decided by a single moment. It is written slowly, through thousands of small choices, through friendships, through mistakes, through kindness, through courage, through the quiet decision to keep going. And somewhere, in the enormous city of London, a boy who had once felt completely lost began to understand something. He might never belong to only one place. And perhaps that was all right. Perhaps belonging did not require choosing. Perhaps he could remember where he came from, while still becoming someone new. Perhaps he could carry the past without letting it write the future. Perhaps he could miss the people he loved and still make new friends. Perhaps he could be grateful for safety and still wish for more. Perhaps he could be afraid and still be brave. Perhaps he could be uncertain and still have hope. The city outside grew quieter. The streets slowly emptied. The lights in the windows faded, one by one. Somewhere, a bus moved gently through the darkness. Somewhere else, a family sat together around a table. Somewhere, a child was falling asleep. And somewhere, perhaps, another child was waiting for a decision, waiting for a letter, waiting for a parent, waiting for someone to say, "You are safe now. You can stay. You belong here." Alem could not know what the future held for every child like him, but he knew this. They deserved to be seen. They deserved to be heard. They deserved to be treated as people, and they deserved the chance to become more than the circumstances that carried them to a new country. The night deepened, and Alem slept, for once, perhaps, without needing to know what tomorrow would bring, because tomorrow would come, whether he was ready or not, and when it came, he would meet it. He would wake, he would breathe, he would step outside, he would walk through the streets of London, and he would keep becoming the person he was meant to be. The journey of a refugee is often described as a journey from one place to another, but Alem's journey was different. It was a journey from fear towards courage, from loneliness towards friendship, from uncertainty towards hope, from being told who he was towards discovering who he wanted to become. And perhaps, in the end, the most important journey was the one that happened inside him. The journey of learning that losing one home does not mean losing every chance of finding another. That a person can be far from their family without ever being separated from their love. That memories can hurt and still be precious. That the future can be uncertain and still be worth reaching for. So if you are listening tonight, perhaps you can picture Alem walking softly through London. The city is quiet now. The rain has stopped. The pavement shines beneath the streetlights. A few windows still glow, warm and gold. The world is sleeping, and the boy walks on. He does not know exactly where the road will lead, but he knows something now that he did not know when he first arrived. He is not alone. There are people who care about him, people who remember his name, people who want him to be safe, and there are places in this world where he has begun to belong. Maybe home is not always the place where you began. Maybe home is the place you slowly create. Maybe it is the people who stand beside you, the memories you keep, the hope you carry forward, and maybe, sometimes, home is simply the feeling and that you're finally allowed to imagine tomorrow. The night grows deeper, the city grows softer, and the boy between two worlds closes his eyes. For a little while, there are no borders, no forms, no questions, no decisions, only darkness, only quiet, only rest. And somewhere inside that quiet, a new day waits, a day that has not yet been written, a day full of gentle possibilities, a day in which Alem can learn more, laugh more, love more, dream more, a day in which the story is still being written. And perhaps that is the greatest gift of all, knowing that the story is still being written, that no matter how hard the beginning has been, the ending is not yet known, that a person can leave one place and still find another, that a child can lose a home and still discover belonging. That fear can rest beside hope, that sadness can rest beside happiness, and that even after the darkest night, morning always comes. So rest now. Let the city become quiet. Let the roads empty. Let the lights fade. And let the story settle gently into the silence. Somewhere, a boy is dreaming. Somewhere, a family is waiting. Somewhere, a friend is remembering a name. And somewhere, a new home is slowly being built, stone by stone, day by day, heart by heart. And perhaps, when morning comes, Alem will open his eyes, he will look out at the world, and for the first time, he will not ask only, "Where do I belong?" Instead, he will begin to ask, "What can I become?" And that question is a different kind of beginning, a hopeful one, a brave one, a beginning that belongs entirely to him. Good night, Alem. Good night, London. Good night to every child who has ever crossed a border, carrying nothing but a memory of home. And good night to everyone who is still searching for a place where they can finally feel safe. May they find kindness, may they find friendship, may they find peace, and may they always remember that wherever their journey begins, the story does not have to end there. And good night to you too, wherever you are. Sleep softly, you are safe, and tomorrow is still being written.